of you here this morning. Welcome to the worship service of the Parish Church of Christ. We are having some beautiful weather, aren't we? 80-degree weather in the middle of August. If this is the result of global warming, I'll have all of it. In North Alabama, there was born in 1880 a young lady whose likeness is now on the Alabama State Board, Helen Keller. You know, Helen Keller was born deaf and mute, and she struggled against odds that are normal for someone in that situation, and eventually went on to become at least an ambassador of peace at large for the United States. Anne Sullivan was a very patient and determined teacher. And since that time, Helen Keller has inspired hundreds, maybe thousands, or millions of people to see what possibilities are. Not to look at what is, but to be able to see what is not. On the quarter are the words on a banner underneath her sitting on the chair, "Spirit of Courage." And Helen Keller has indeed inspired many people to face their fears and to step out on courage and do things that they did not know at first that could be done. I have a blind roommate in college. I've told you this before, and he has inspired me with what he could accomplish. But there's another man that I want us to study this morning who was struck blind by the God of heaven. But when he came to the lines, he has since inspired and instructed and encouraged millions of people since that time. And that man, of course, is Saul of Tarsus. Let me invite you to turn to Acts chapter 9. If you're using the Bible in the pew, it's page 917. It's easy enough to remember. Our text is chapter 9, verse 17 on page 917. But let's first of all look at the background of Saul of Tarsus. Saul tells us in several of his writings what kind of background he had, and it is important to understand Saul's background, in order to understand the power of his conversion. And this is a lesson for another time, but the very fact that Saul of Tarsus became a Christian is a very powerful argument for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And a lot of that power goes back to the kind of man that Paul was. Paul writes in Philippians chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, when he's talking about his background, he says, for example, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. Now that is a Jewish way of stating the highest category. You're familiar with the holiest of holy places in the tabernacle. It was the far back room in which was kept the Ark of the Covenant. It was the most holy place. And that's why the Hebrews called it the holiest of holy places. The Song of Solomon is translated in chapter 1, verse 1, the Song of Songs. In other words, it is the greatest, the best, the most beautiful of all songs. And so in that spirit, Paul calls himself a Hebrew of the Hebrews. He was a card-carrying member of the Jewish nation. He was a red-blooded Jew. And it's important to understand that. He studied in Jerusalem at the feet of a Jewish scribe, a Jewish rabbi Gamaliel was the most widely respected scribe in Jerusalem. For a young man, growing up around 12 or 13 years old, to be chosen to study with Gamaliel would be the highest honor. And Paul was chosen, Saul was chosen, no doubt, for many reasons. He came from a very Jewish family. He was also, no doubt, a quick learner. He had a sharp mind, and we know that from his writings now. And so he was chosen. And as a result of the influence of Gamaliel and other Jews that were in Saul's life, he was also a member of the party of the Pharisees, who were the strictest sect of Judaism. They were the ones who were very particular about keeping the law of Moses. And so much so that they even developed traditions around the law of Moses to keep them from violating the law of Moses. Now Jesus would criticize them for that, because they elevated their traditions to the law of God. But it does illustrate to us how strongly the Pharisees felt about the law. They were to give 10%, a tithe of their garden herbs. And Jesus points out that, in fact, the Pharisees were very particular about doing that in Matthew chapter 23. Here's one sprig of mint for God and 10 sprigs of mint for me. One sprig of, I don't know what, for God, anise, 9 for me. They were very particular about that. And that's the kind of Jew Paul was. And Paul writes in Galatians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, he said, I studied the Jewish religion from the tradition of the Pharisees, and I excelled among all of my contemporaries. And so Paul might have said that he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. I want us to get that in mind. Paul was a die-hard Pharisaical Jew. And so when Christianity was established, Saul thought it was a fraud. He writes about his previous life in 1 Timothy chapter 1, and he says that when he persecuted the church, he did it ignorantly in unbelief, which means Paul did not believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, I don't know what he thought happened. I don't know how he explained the empty tomb. Maybe he thought the disciples stole the body. Well, then he'd have to explain how the disciples got through 70 Roman soldiers who were tasked with guarding the tomb and killing anybody who tried. I don't know how he would explain that. Maybe he thought that the guards themselves had stolen the body. I don't know how he would explain that. The guards had Jesus, and the Jewish leaders had Jesus just where they wanted him. They wanted him shut up, and they had him in the tomb. What would motivate them to steal his body and allow this rumor of resurrection to spread like wildfire? I don't know what went through Saul's mind. I don't know how he explained the empty tomb. But he clearly did not believe it. And so when we pick up in Acts chapter 8, if you want to look over at the other page there in Acts chapter 8, we are first introduced to Saul at the stoning of Stephen, a Christian, a deacon, likely, in the church in Jerusalem. He was chosen back in chapter 6. As Stephen was preaching the resurrection of Christ, or preaching salvation is in Christ, and he was preaching in front of a synagogue of Jews, and they got mad at him. And they dragged him out, and they started stoning him to death. And Luke, the historian, tells us that they laid their coats down at the feet of Saul of Tarsus. Saul was probably a member of that particular synagogue where Stephen had been preaching. And because Saul did not participate in the actual stoning, but rather they laid their coats there for him to guard, suggests that he probably had some type of leadership position, some type of authority, as he watched over everybody else stoning Stephen to death. And then we find in Acts chapter 8 that Saul went on persecuting Christians after Stephen's death. And Luke writes that Saul ravaged the church. Now what kind of picture do we get there? If you wanted to break up some kind of movement, where would you start? You'd go after the leadership, wouldn't you? You'd go after the leadership. In Christianity, you'd go after the elders and the deacons and the preachers. You would go after those members in the body who were the most influential. You'd go after those who had contacts in the business world, and you'd go after them. And Saul did that. And he did that with great passion. He enjoyed what he was doing because he thought that he was serving God. He thought that Christianity was a deviant sect of Judaism. And he thought that Christianity was teaching against the law of Moses, against animal sacrifices, against circumcision, and against celebrating the Sabbath day. Against animal sacrifices and that atonement for sins were obtained through that. And he thought Jesus was a fraud. And so he thought all of these Christians that were out there preaching and teaching Jesus Christ, he thought they were all frauds and they were all liars. And so he personally felt very strongly that he had God's permission and God's will to do what he was doing at the time. And then when we get to Acts chapter 9, we see in the early part of this chapter that Saul, in fact, goes to the high priest in Jerusalem. And he gets letters from them giving him permission to go to different cities in the area and arrest Christians and carry them into prison and potentially even death. And so when Acts chapter 9 starts, Saul is on his way to Damascus with this thought in mind: capturing Christians, getting them to confess Jesus Christ because he thought that was foolishness and that it was grounds for blasphemy, because the Christians in fact believed that Jesus was God in the flesh, and he was Emmanuel, God with us. And if Christians believed that Jesus was God in the flesh, then that was blasphemy, and the law of Moses commanded stoning for blasphemy. And so Saul thought that he had the Bible behind him. And then we pick up in verse 3 of chapter 9. As Saul was traveling, it happened that he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. And Saul fell to the ground because the light was so bright. And he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Well, there's only one being who can speak from heaven. And that's God. And Saul served God. Saul loved God. The very thing that he was on the road to Damascus to do was to serve God. And now God is asking him, "Why are you persecuting me?" You talk about having some cognitive dissonance. Saul was confused. Who are you, Lord? That's the question he asks. Who are you, Lord? I'm not persecuting God. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. You think that you're persecuting a wayward group of Jews? Saul, you're blind. You're persecuting. Get up, verse 6. And enter the city, Damascus, and it will be told you what you must do. And Saul was struck blind, verse 8. Though his eyes were open, he could see nothing.